Imagine this: the thunder of cannons shaking the earth, the smoke of musket fire hanging like a shroud over the battlefield, and amidst it all, a single figure on horseback, his hand raised, his eyes cold, unyielding, and calculating. Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, emperor, and one of the most polarizing figures in history. Whether seen as a tyrant or as a visionary, one thing remains unquestionable: his ability to reshape the very art of war. In less than 2 decades, Napoleon transformed the way armies moved, fought, and conquered, building an empire that stretched across Europe and shook the world to its core. Today, we will uncover the secret mechanics of his seemingly infallible tactics, exploring how he engineered victories against forces far larger than his own, and why, even centuries later, military academies still study his campaigns with awe. This is not just history, it is a masterclass in strategy, deception, and raw ambition. Napoleon's rise as a strategist begins with one simple principle: speed kills. He understood that war was not only about the clash of armies, but about outhinking, outmaneuvering, and overwhelming an enemy before they even had the chance to react. In his early campaigns in Italy, he turned poorly fed, ragged French troops into a force that devastated the Austrian Empire's holdings. Historian David Chandler, in the campaigns of Napoleon 1966, emphasizes that Napoleon's Italian campaign was a laboratory of strategy, where he perfected the art of rapid marches, concentration of force, and the famed central position. What this meant in practice was simple yet devastating. Napoleon would divide his enemy's forces, strike one with overwhelming strength, crush it quickly, and then pivot with lightning speed to annihilate the other. This allowed him to defeat armies often 2 or 3 times the size of his own. Take, for instance, the Battle of Montenat in April 1796. Napoleon identified the weakness in the Austrian-Piedmontese alliance. They were spread out and poorly coordinated. Instead of attacking head-on, he launched a swift and focused assault on the separated Piedmontese army, forcing them into retreat, and then turned to isolate the Austrians. This pattern became the blueprint for countless Napoleonic victories. The principle was brilliantly summarized by the Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz in his classic on War 1832. The first principle is to act with the utmost concentration. The second is never to lose time. Napoleon embodied both. But sheer speed was not enough. Napoleon mastered deception as an art form. He would feint retreats, use false intelligence, and create illusions of weakness to lure his opponents into traps. The Battle of Ulm in 1805 stands as one of his masterpieces. With a sweeping maneuver, he encircled the Austrian general Mack's army without a decisive battle, capturing over 60,000 men in one stroke. Chandler notes that never was a campaign won with so little bloodshed, and never was the psychological dominance of Napoleon more apparent. This was warfare beyond the battlefield. It was chess played on a continental scale. And then came Austerlitz, December 2nd, 1805, the battle that immortalized Napoleon as the Son of Austerlitz. Facing a combined Austro-Russian force larger than his own, Napoleon executed what military historian Andrew Roberts, in his book Napoleon, Alive 2014, calls a tactical symphony. He feigned weakness, intentionally thinning his right flank to lure the Allies into attacking. When they bit the bait, Napoleon unleashed his hidden reserves, driving straight through the enemy's center and cutting their army in two. In one dazzling maneuver, he shattered the myth of coalition invincibility. Clausewitz himself later wrote, "Never was a battle won with more complete success." And before we march further into Napoleon's campaigns, let me ask you this: if you're fascinated by the genius of history's greatest commanders, make sure to subscribe to Vertex of Time. Here, we dive deep into the strategies, the victories, and the failures that shape civilizations. Turn on the notifications so you never miss a single story where the past comes alive. Returning to Napoleon's battlefield brilliance, we cannot ignore his innovative use of artillery. Unlike many generals who treated cannons as static defensive tools, Napoleon wielded them as offensive sledgehammers. His philosophy was direct. Artillery should not just support infantry, it should destroy the enemy's will to fight. At the Battle of Wagram in 1809, he concentrated over 100 cannons into a grand battery, unleashing a devastating barrage that ripped through Austrian lines. Historian Gunther Rothenberg, in The Art of Warfare in the Age of Napoleon 1978, argues that this massing of artillery revolutionized modern warfare, foreshadowing the industrialized firepower of later centuries. Equally vital was Napoleon's use of the course system, which allowed his armies to function like independent organisms, each capable of marching, fighting, and sustaining itself. This meant his forces could spread out to forage and move quickly, then converge at the decisive point. The corps system, as historian John Elting explains in Swords Around a Throne 1988, was the embodiment of operational flexibility, a weapon Napoleon wielded with unmatched mastery. No longer were armies clumsy masses tethered to long supply lines. Under Napoleon, they became fluid, adaptable, and terrifyingly efficient. The secret to his infallibility was not just organization or firepower, it was the synchronization of every element into a single devastating blow. Napoleon thought like a conductor, and the battlefield was his orchestra. Yet even the greatest conductor cannot play forever. His brilliance at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram gradually gave way to the grinding reality of attrition, particularly in Spain and Russia. The Peninsular War drained French resources through guerrilla warfare, while the invasion of Russia in 1812 exposed the fatal flaw in his reliance on speed. Against vast spaces and a scorched earth strategy, speed becomes meaningless. As historian Dominic Levin observes in Russia against Napoleon 2009, the Russian campaign was less a battle against an army than against geography and climate. Yet, despite these failures, his earlier tactics remain immortal lessons. The legacy of Napoleon is so enduring that even modern generals, from Moltke the Elder to Eisenhower, studied his campaigns meticulously. In fact, the Prussian general staff system was heavily inspired by Napoleon's course, and West Point cadets still analyze Austerlitz as the epitome of battlefield deception. And perhaps this is the paradox of Napoleon. The man who seemed invincible was undone not by a single army, but by time, endurance, and the limits of his own ambition. Waterloo in 1815 was not simply a defeat of tactics, but a culmination of years of resistance against a man who had reshaped the very definition of war. As the guns fell silent, Napoleon's enemies may have celebrated his downfall, but his shadow loomed larger than ever. He was exiled, yes, but his methods lived on, etched into the doctrines of every modern army. His genius lay not in mystical infallibility, but in relentless adaptability, in the ruthless exploitation of time, speed, and psychology. And so, as we look back at Napoleon's tactics, we're not merely revisiting dusty campaigns of the past, we are witnessing the blueprint of modern warfare itself. From central position to corps maneuvering, from artillery dominance to the art of deception, Napoleon remains the general every strategist must either learn from or risk repeating the mistakes of those who underestimated him. In the words of historian Andrew Roberts, other men dreamed of empires. Napoleon created them, if only for a moment. And in that moment, he taught the world how wars could be won. This is why, even in defeat, Napoleon's strategies still march across time. They are not relics, they are living lessons, whispered across battlefields long after the man himself was gone. Because Napoleon did not just fight wars. He redefined them. And his shadow still stands like a titan at the very heart of military history,